You know, thanks for coming down to talk. Kathy, we've been talking a little bit about emerging educational technology trends. And recently we kind of settled on looking at, VR or virtual reality. So for those that don't know, what is virtual reality?
I would say my understanding is evolving, but what I understand of it so far is that virtual reality immerses the user in a 3D environment. So it's different from the internet in that way, which is a 2D experience, two-dimensional experience. One way that virtual reality can be experienced is by using a headset. So you put on a headset, and by moving your head, you shift your position in your environment so you can see different views and experience that environment in different ways.
That's pretty cool. I know that we've been kind of talking about how did we get here, and I can only think of like the evolution. I always thought, I've been told that like geniuses can go from like point A to point C or D without having to see like that B. But I'm always looking for the B to see the steps that we've taken. And when I look at it, we have things like started with like a 3D image that kind of popped out a little bit, and then so it kind of started to invade our space a little bit there. And then we move into like say movies that you kind of immerse yourself into, like 3D movies and the like. And now we move to things like, I was talking with one of my friends about, I don't know if you heard of this, there's video games like Call of Duty. And so like they're online games that now they've moved for, I know that we were talking before about like the Super Mario where it looked like a picture that was drawn moving sideways across the screen. And now with like the Call of Duty as it's evolved, now you're looking through the player's eyes almost, like you're there. You can see your hands as if you were there, and now you're interacting with other people that are coming in. So now moving from there, almost like taking that concept of instead of just playing with a controller, now the way you mentioned with the goggles, like you put the glasses on and you are that player. So now when I turn my head as opposed to the controller, now I'm in that world, and it's all around me, and the sounds and everything like that. And I think it's really cool, and I can only think about where, evolutionary wise, where we're going to go with it.
Yeah.
I always harken back to most technology, whether it be cell phones or medical equipment, has always come from like Star Trek. I'm a big Trekkie, sorry for those that aren't Trekkies out there, but they have this thing called a holodeck, and in their world you can go into it and you can create any place like Paris 1963, and not only does it create the images like we have with our virtual reality, but it allows you to interact with like physical, tactile things, and I can only imagine that we're going to get there. We had a conversation a little while ago about how we would get there, and the next thing that I think is incorporating like body suits into the virtual reality world, where now if you're in, say, let's say you're going walking in the rain, the bodysuit will mimic the little raindrops on you, but we're still a ways from there. But I kind of see that as the evolution of how did we get here. So,
Yeah.
But why don't we take a quick look at a little scene from Star Trek to see where that end result could be.
Sounds good.
All right.
So what we have here is a couple images showing you what the holodeck would look like from Star Trek. So the holodeck in Star Trek is essentially what holds the virtual environment and controls the virtual environment. In the first image you see here, you're going to have a panel on the right-hand side, which is what you would use to load whatever program you're looking for if you're in the middle of a story. So you can do a virtual novel where you're a character, part of the story, or you're looking to train on a specific piece of equipment. Whatever the program might be, you load it on the right-hand side, and then you would step into this room. Now, the first image shows you what the room looks like without a program loaded. So it's got those grid lines and on the floor that you see, and they essentially help map out where different objects would be when the program actually gets up and running. The second image you're going to see is going to be with the program loaded. So as you can see there, when the person walks through, they're going to see all of the environment and interact directly with what they have there. What we weren't able to show is how tactile everything gets. So as you enter into the holodeck, you actually can interact with different pieces and the different artifacts that are in there. So when there's a rock there, you can pick up the rock and you can throw it and it feels real. And that, I think that is the next step that, or not the next step, but that's like the future that we're aiming for, is not only can you do virtual reality, but you can actually do interactive, true interactive virtual environments.
It'll be really cool when we get to that point one day. I don't think we're quite there yet, but from what I've been hearing and seeing from just doing a little bit of reading and looking on the internet, is there are already some really great things happening in with virtual reality, and specifically in education. I read one story from the Wall Street Journal. This was written by Lindsay Gelman, and she talks about virtual reality at MIT and how in 2012, after Hurricane Sandy, they were trying to run one of their executive business courses.
Okay.
But a lot of the students in the class had trouble getting there.
That would be a big problem, I would think.
Yeah, yeah. And so they had already been working with a company to look at virtual reality in the classroom, and they thought, well, why don't we try it now to bring these students and give them access? And so they connected their own classroom to a virtual reality space. And about half the students, and it was a fairly large class, were able to create avatars and participate that way. So I think it had a really big advantage for the students in that really difficult scenario to give them access to their program and to keep their involvement with the program consistent and continuous at that time. And also for the program coordinators and developers to be able to carry on and run. So, you know, that to me is one real advantage, actually, it's a very practical advantage of using virtual reality in education.
Yeah, and you know, now that you mention it, there is, I've actually also seen a video recently where the medical students have actually used virtual reality to be able to see the inner workings of the human body. So instead of doing an autopsy on like a cadaver, they can actually, what they do is they put on the virtual reality headset, and then so they have the image of either a female or male pop up, and they can actually pick the different parts that they want to look at. And contrary to the real life, you can actually pull out like their liver and you can flip it around. Or there was one that was doing cardiac surgery, and they were able to bring out the heart and flip it around and actually see the different components that you normally wouldn't be able to see. And they say it was hugely helpful for the living. So you'd mentioned the over at I think it was MIT you mentioned, where they the access, and so this provides a little bit of access as well, but also a little bit moving to that experiential type learning. So
what a great way to investigate when you compare that to looking at the liver or the heart in a textbook.
Absolutely.
Right? Or even on your screen on a computer. That is so rich. Yeah, I think of other experiential examples too, from the magazine The Geography Teacher, where an educator in geography talks about being able to take his students to different places, to be able to take them to the Amazon through virtual reality to experience what that environment is like.
Yeah, I mean, that would be crazy. Like that, you could even use that for history. I'm imagining like you could even put somebody in like the throes of like the D-Day landing of what it would be like. It's I remember when Saving Private Ryan came out, people were like, just the sound effects were like, oh my God, I felt like I was there.
Yeah.
Combining that with virtual reality, you could actually give them a sense of the history of the time that they were in.
Yeah.
I think that's really cool. Maybe I would have paid more attention in history had that been the case.
Right, or a World War I trench, right? What was that
Yeah.
like to be situated there?
Yeah.
That real kind of sensory experience.
Absolutely. I'm even thinking that as we look at stuff like that, like we look at Canadian history, like how can we look at maybe how voyageurs did it, and you know, what were life on the prairies before we had like cell phones and wireless networks and the internet type thing. So
Exactly. What a great way to engage kids in education.
absolutely.
Do you think, Josh, like from what you've studied and investigated with virtual reality, is there any kind of drawback or things that we need to consider?
Well, I mean, whenever we look at a new technology, we always want to do like a good analysis of what's going on, and there definitely are some things. It's one thing with virtual reality is going to be the cost. Like the cost right now is really quite prohibitive. versus, you know, being able to use it on an everyday placement. You're looking at just the headsets alone are somewhere around like $800 per headset, and then you're looking at the cost of the computer hardware you need to be able to run it. So even getting a graphics card that's good enough to run it, and they some websites have estimated to be around $1,000 just for that. So you're looking at it like an $1,800 investment just there to do basic VR. And when you're thinking of like a classroom of let's say like high school students, they're doing classrooms of like 30 or 40, right? That starts to get a pretty pricey price tag, and not to mention there are other costs that go into it. I think you mentioned before talking about like the development of the environment alone would increase costs. So it really becomes prohibitive. I'm not sure if there's any other things that you found about the like feasibility of cost, but.
Yeah, on the practical side, I think about ease of use. And, you know, just from my own experience, putting on a headset is pretty easy, it's pretty intuitive to get started with it. But there are different ways of presenting virtual reality and different types of technologies that students would have to get used to use it. And I think as a teacher, I would want to consider that. How difficult is this learning burden of the technology itself going to be for my students, and make sure that I account for that.
Yeah, well, and yeah, now that you mentioned, I was thinking back to the video I was watching, and the video. So when they were in the environment for the medical students, they would literally, when they wanted to view a part, they would go and they would click it.
Yeah.
And so, but how do you know that that's the motion that you do, and how do you know to like swipe your hand like this if you want it to move, or and not everything's the same.
Right.
Right. So.
It's going to take some training for everybody,
Absolutely.
for the teacher, for the students to get comfortable and know how to use it.
Yeah, and based on technology, that can take some time. I can only imagine that, you know, it might be a slow burn to get everybody up and running and moving, so.
Right,
yeah.
Right. What you were saying reminds me too of another thing that was mentioned in the geography teacher article. This geography educator mentions how we have to also think about how different learners will interact, even on the physiological level, to being in a virtual reality environment.
Yeah.
You know, how will a student react to being, you know, a participant in D-Day, for example? To go back to that example. And what kind of internal physical responses might there be to what they're seeing and viewing?
I mean, that for education, that you're definitely right. That's important. As a physical teacher in a classroom, you can always tell.
Right.
You can sort of read the room. You know, is somebody, you know, being overwhelmed? Is somebody, you know, being upset by what we're watching? But like, you look in the virtual world, and there's just there's so many people there that we don't see. So how are we affecting them? I mean, I can only imagine that the way that we train our educators is going to have to change dramatically with that, so that they are more aware of that and more aware of how the technology works and things like that.
And on deeper levels too, like with the critical analysis component.
Yes.
You know, like helping students develop their critical information literacy so that they look at the bias behind the way these realities are presented, who is creating the virtual reality, for what purpose are they creating that reality, what have they selected within that environment to focus your attention on, what have they ignored and left and is not presented to you. I think those critical information literacy skills are even more important with virtual reality than with the internet, because the experience is so powerful, could be so powerful and sensory.
Yeah, it's almost like it would be much easier to be taken as fact, because you're like, I was there.
Yeah.
Especially when you remember it years later, like, oh yeah, I remember that time. I think it would almost have the same effect as kind of that dream state effect, where you dream something and then you remember it as fact later on, but no, you dreamed it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been in trouble once or twice for dreams that I didn't do anything in, but later on it was my fault.
Right. That it has its potential, right? So there are all these things, all these aspects of using this technology in the classroom that I think it's ripe for research and looking at how do these things work for learners.
Yeah, so something that we're kind of on the cusp of, but we definitely need to invest a little bit more into it
Yeah.
before we throw it in the classrooms type of idea.
Yeah,
Okay,
maybe.
all right.
Lots of potential.
I like that. Yeah, I look forward to seeing where we can go with it.
Yeah, me too.
Nice. Well, thank you very much for joining us.